Advisory Board for the FIU Sea Level Solutions Center will educate us on these issues this evening. There'll be a question and answer series, and Dr. Troxler will tell us about the next two parts of the series before we leave this evening. Before we start, Mayor Kaysen would like to make some remarks. He has been very, very involved in both locally and throughout the states and throughout our state on this issue of sea level rise.
Thank you for all turning out. It's great. What a turnout compared to the last one we have. I think maybe people are getting more aware and interested in this. We had this cartoon done to take a look at that sort of outlines the dilemma that we as municipal authorities have. There are two people talking about, one, how come the traffic circles that they want haven't been built, and the garbage pits are too deep and they're standing in water up to their waist. And it's amazingly, I was with a group of 6 or 7 mayors from South Florida recently, and I said, any of you received an email on sea level concerns from your residents? And they all said no. And it's amazing for a population with such a high number of university educated people. So it's important to start at the local level, raising awareness. We've done some LiDAR maps, which Matt Anderson has, to begin to look at what our risk is and how high we are above, in every part of Coral Gables above mean sea level. So it's the first step. We have all of our critical infrastructure on it. This is at a 7-inch LiDAR, in other words, 7 inches accuracy. We hope to get down eventually to 1 inch, which the Key West is doing. So starting off with having accurate data, and then based on that, deciding what you're going to do in the coming years, how you're going to manage risk is what we're about. So thank you all for coming, and thank FIU for participating with us in this.
Thank you. I'd like to also acknowledge Commissioner Jeanette Sleznick is here with us this evening too. Thank you. It's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Commissioner Keon and Mayor. We are incredibly happy to be here. It's been a pleasure to co-organize this activity with Matt Anderson and his team, and it's a real pleasure to be here, sort of kicking off not just an event but a discussion series, which I think attests to the real importance that the city of Coral Gables places on this issue. So just very briefly, the Sea Level Solutions Center at Florida International University, this was launched in July of last year. And essentially it's a university-wide initiative, so it's meant to be interdisciplinary. And the real important aspect of interdisciplinary action, interdisciplinary activities is that it brings in all of the sectors of society in order to look at the types of trade-offs that we might be considering, the types of co-benefits that we could deliver if we were able to evaluate all of these interacting factors at once when we think about sea level rise and what's needed for adaptation and what's needed for building resilience in South Florida. So it's about economic prosperity, social prosperity, and political prosperity for all citizens of South Florida. And that's what we're trying to promote by taking science, by taking interdisciplinary work and converting it to knowledge that can be used for the benefit of society. And one way that we do that is training the next generation of students. And so we've just launched this, we're calling it the Sea Level Solutions Center Interdisciplinary Studio, and it takes, and we're working with architecture faculty, faculty in law, economics, hydrology, engineering, and biology, and bringing all those faculty and students together to focus their energy on one problem and try to come up with the scenarios and the types of outcomes that might be expected associated with sea level rise and storm surge impacts in South Florida. So it's a real neat opportunity for our students. It gets them to think about how they can most effectively collaborate in these sort of interdisciplinary environments. So with that, I'm just going to, again, introduce Dr. Todd Crowell. He's the director of our Institute for Water and Environment. And he gave a TEDx talk at FIU, and it was received with such grand acclaim that he was invited back to give a sort of a rendition of that talk here. So, Todd.
Thanks very much, Tiffany. Mr. Mayor, Commissioners, thank you very much. Matt and Tiffany, thanks very much for organizing this. And especially thank you all for coming and thinking about it. As the Mayor said, it's quite interesting that we live where we do and we're not having these conversations constantly because we all know it's going to have a big impact on us on our daily lives. If you live in South Beach, it already does, right? So how many of you saw the TEDx talk that's online? If you haven't, you might want to do that when it's a more popular edition. I'm actually going to go into a little bit more detail and a little bit more of the science behind it because you're going to start talking about this over the next few days. What?
They use the mic because it's televised. So
It's being
it's
televised.
televised.
It'll be
Okay,
shown
sorry.
later on the
Okay.
Coral Gables TV
Okay.
channel.
One of the things that we do, and this has been developed by a research team at FIU, is to sort of, when we think about South Florida, we think about it with this framework. We have to understand the global issues, and that's what we're going to talk about today, sea level rise and the things associated with that. We have to talk about urban vulnerability, and that's certainly one of the things that your mayors and county and city commissioners are interested in. And then all of the things surrounding it. I'm an ecologist by training, and so I'm very interested in not just finding engineering and built solutions to the problems, but trying to use the things that we have, like our coral reefs and our seagrass beds and our existing mangroves, as a natural buffer to the kinds of things that we face, okay? So that's sort of how we think about this in a holistic way. So, as I've already said, and for you that live here, you already know, this is already impacting us, right? We had this great thing that brought national attention. Dr. Rita Tutonico from FIU is sitting here, and she'd helped organize a thing with ex-Vice President Al Gore, who came to town, and Tiffany was part of that, and sort of talked about climate reality and stuff, and the weekend he came happened to be a King Tide weekend. And so there is ex-Vice President Gore in his three-piece suit walking down South Beach in wading boots, and he still got wet. It still went over the tops of his boots, and he had to go change his suit, right? So you don't have to tell him that we got issues and that the seas are rising, right? It was a beautiful sunny day. There was no sign of rain, and yet the cities were completely flooded. I'm going to show you a series of maps. Many of you have probably seen these. They're getting a lot of acclaim, but these are made by our friend and colleague Pete Harlem at FIU. And these are sort of the best available data. It's using the kinds of technology that Matt's talking about, the LIDAR, with really good elevations, and then the best sort of predictions we have about what it is that we're likely to face. And I'll go back and talk about how we come about these kinds of predictions, where we're pretty confident, where we know there's some wiggle room, where we're not uncertain, but ultimately what the general patterns are going to be, okay? So this is what we look like right now, and for those of you who live in this area, you know that we're really in deep trouble because like the highest point here is a landfill, right? That's our highest point in South Florida. So, you know, I don't particularly want to build a house there, but that's the highest and driest place we're going to see. So here we go, and of course what you know and what the data all tell us as carbon dioxide goes in the atmosphere, temperatures rise because it traps heat, and that causes ice to melt and the seas to rise, okay? So here's what we do. We start getting, and you can see the temperature is here going up, so that's 1 degree right there, so you can watch it go up 1/10 of a degree or so at a time, or a couple tenths, and you can already see that the south part of South Florida and a bunch of the keys are underwater, and then 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet. Now this is a really important figure because this is what happens when average sea surface temperature goes to 0.8 degrees warmer than it has been for the last few thousand years. Why is that so significant? It's where we are now. We already hit that. This will happen. You know, we don't know exactly when this will happen, but this will happen. We've already trapped enough heat in the environment to cause enough of the ice to melt and seas to expand that this will happen. We don't know exactly how fast and how long it takes for the the temperature and ice melt to equilibrate, but we know this is going to happen. We're already there, okay? And then we keep going, and by the way, you all know where you sit, right? You sit right in that little area right there. So far, so good. You know, you're on the mountaintop looking down. We get to 7 feet, you're still hanging in there. 8 feet, still hanging in there. 9 feet, you're there. I mean, it's you know, it'd be a long golf shot from one golf course to the other, but you're still there. And 10 feet, you're okay, and now 11 feet and things aren't so good. Now I say you all, I'm really delighted to be talking to you because I happen to live over by the golf course, right? So I care a lot about how these things work and how good we are at our predictions, right? I gotta decide how I'm gonna booster my backyard also. Okay, so those are sort of the best available models. Are there issues with them? Of course there are. We don't have the best groundwater built in yet. It could be worse. But how do we get these things? How do we come up with these, and how believable are they, and how much confidence do we have? Well, there's a whole bunch of ways that science has come along in the last 100 years to get us where we are, to have a cartoon that looks like this. I mean, this is a really compelling set of figures, right? And so we get there by a few things. We look at historic patterns. What we're seeing is not unique in most respects. It's unique in one. We actually make observations. Over the last 100 years, it's a myth that all we do is predict this stuff and model it, and we don't observe anything. That's absolutely not true. We have 100 years of observations that I'll show you, and over the last 25 years, we've got a lot of really good observations. But yes, we do have to model it. We have to do the best we can in terms of science to try to make predictions both spatially and temporally about how we think things are going to look, okay? So let's talk about the historic patterns. This is a time span of 400,000 years. This is what you need to know. Look at the green lines. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Let's start here. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. What happens? Global temperature goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. See the pattern? It's really pretty clear. And then what happens? Sea level rise, a little bit of a time lag. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, right? That part of the science is not refutable. When you put CO2 in the air, you trap heat. When you trap heat, a couple of things happen. Ice melts, the ice caps, that's a no-brainer. The other thing that happens that we sometimes don't think about is warm water expands, right? So the warmer the water is, the more volume it takes up. So even if you didn't have any ice melting at all, the ocean would still rise just because warm water is bigger in volume than cold water. And then some other things happen, like when you have a lot of freezing and thawing and a lot of inundation of water and drying, the actual land starts subsiding. And so our coastlines are actually sinking. So you put all those things together, and that's what goes into the sea level projections about where things are vulnerable, okay? But this part of the science isn't refutable. CO2 goes up, temperature goes up, sea level goes up. It's been happening for as long as we have been able to measure it. Now, you might ask me, how did you measure that 400,000 years ago? And the answer is, it's really kind of easy. So in the Antarctica, the North and South Poles, we have this amazing data set. It's these big ice sheets, right? And so you can core down into the ice. You can age it by the age of oxygen as well as some other things. And then when you melt the ice, what you get is oxygen, carbon dioxide, and some other gases. You can actually measure the concentration of carbon dioxide that was in the atmosphere when that ice froze, okay? So that's how we get the data. It's not magic, it's not thought about, it's not extrapolated, it's actually truly measured, okay? And so there it goes, up and down, up and down, up and down. Now, since this Mauna Loa, we've actually been measuring it, and yes, it matches exactly as we'd expect. So this is a natural cycle. What's not natural is this, right? I mean, look how high that's gone, and look how fast it's gone. We've had a couple of periods where it went up pretty fast, but never to the rate that we see now, and never to the extent we've seen now, okay? So that's the data. Again, that's just real data that gets collected, okay? So here's the part we're worried about. Here's that relationship. Increased CO2, increased temperature, get increased sea level for all the reasons I've said. And now what we don't know, and this is where modeling comes in and where uncertainty comes in, is we know these will rise The question is, how fast will they rise? What's the lag time? And so when will these two things catch up with this? I mean, we've never measured anything this high before. And so the question is, how long will that take to sort of catch up with that? And our science is not precise about that. I'm not going to lie to you. It's getting better and better, and we're collecting more and more data. But I can't tell you at what year Coral Gables will be 10 feet underwater. Okay, I can't tell you exactly that year. I can tell you probably within a couple of decades with a pretty fair amount of certainty. The other thing that people don't often think about is these are tide gauges, and we've had tide gauges throughout the world for the last 100 years, 120 years. Okay, we've been putting these out since we've been sailing the seas. So they first went out in the 1800s. Here's the first batch that went out. So they're all over the northern hemisphere, and then we put out some more. And then finally, we've put some out in the near oceanic islands, so we have a much better coverage. The problem, of course, is with tide gauges is they have to be anchored against land. So are they the perfect, complete record? No. There's a lot of open ocean out there where we can't use tide gauges to measure them. But we've got a pretty good coverage today, and some of these things we've been following for 100 years, okay? So again, this data set has been going on since, I think, 1888, okay? And here we are. Now, we have a lot more in the northern hemisphere than we do in the southern hemisphere. It has to do with shipping lanes, has to do with a lot of things. So again, the data aren't perfect, but there's a lot of data out there. We have measured what the sea level has done over the past 100 years. And now we have satellites, okay? So we've got a whole series of satellites. We just launched another new generation satellite that's not yet online, but it will reach its orbit, I think, in the next week or so. And these satellites basically run a grid pattern, right? They go back and forth over the entire surface of the Earth in every possible direction. So these data are incredible. They're not the resolution that Matt's looking at for his 1-inch resolution LiDAR, but they're pretty good and they're pretty global, and they don't require any kind of land to sort of anchor them, okay? And so now we've got about 25 years of what the seas have actually done in terms of rising, right? All of those data are observations. There's no guessing about it. You know, it's just, it's what has happened, okay? So now we've got a pretty good picture even within our own lifetimes, measuring CO2, watching the heat get trapped in the ocean, and watching sea level change. The uncertainties are about the time lags between this going up and how much heat gets trapped and where, and then how that basically manifests itself in terms of sea level rise. But we have, as we collect more and more of this data, and we tease apart the 4 or 5 most likely models, which allow us to predict what's going to happen in the future, the more data we collect, the better we get at discriminating among the various models. One thing we don't know is how humans are going to react to this. If we continue to burn fossil fuels at the rate we currently are, we're going to be way up here at the fastest, highest sea level rise we're going to get. But we hope that markets kick in, that people start thinking about things, we find alternative technologies, and we change the CO2 budget. And again, we won't know what that time lag looks like in terms of reversing some of these things. But there's some other technologies as well. And okay, so this is where the models come in. We know carbon dioxide increases temperature. That's a function we actually have a mathematical function for. We know increased temperature increases ice melt. We have a pretty good function for that, actually. I'll show you in a minute. But we also have this thermal expansion. Water gets bigger, more volume as it gets warm, and land subsides due to agriculture, thawing, flooding, etc. Okay? So right now, our very best calculations are that for every 1 degree of Celsius of temperature, sea temperature rise, we're going to get 2.3 meters of sea level rise. What we don't know is how long it's going to take for that. But we know that as you increase by 1 degree, you have about that much ice and volume expansion of water that's going to catch up to us eventually, okay? And that's played out pretty well so far. Again, the timing is what we don't know. So here we are. These are those different modeling scenarios I told you about. We might have 14 inches. We might have 26 inches where we're sitting. We don't yet know what the CO2 burn rate will continue to be and what the melting rate continues to be. How many of you have seen some of the latest news items coming out of NASA? So they're getting these really high-resolution pictures, mostly looking at Greenland. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? What's the scary part about those? Yeah, the really scary part is it's melting faster than we thought, and what's even scarier from the Jet Propulsion Lab in California with some of their infrared photography and basically going down 400 feet below sea level and looking at the ice is they're worried that the ice is melting from the bottom, and what it's doing is it's causing this big shelf, and they're worried they're going to start breaking off. If that happens, these lines are probably too slow. You know, I mean, we're probably going to get sea level volumes that are occurring not on this monotonic function, this nice gradual predictive thing, but all of a sudden it's just going to jump up, okay, because these huge volumes are going to come in. By the way, the Greenland ice sheets, by far the biggest contributor of ice melt. Antarctica is a distant second. Those are the two places to keep your eyes on as you're sort of watching how this thing develops. Okay, so you all know about COP21, the big international, climate convention that was just held by the world's leaders in France, and they walked away and said, for heaven's sakes, let's at least cap carbon dioxide emissions to cap a 2-degree total increase in temperature. For us in South Florida, that's not going to get us anywhere. Yes, please.
From what I read, that means that 80% of what they're planning to mine has to stay in the ground, right?
Yeah. No, it's got massive implications for how our economy looks and how it will change. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But if we actually run the world according to that as our goal, we're in not such great shape here. That means 15 feet for us in South Florida. Okay, yes?
These calculations include methane.
No. Yeah, so that's a really great question. So CO2 is the beast in the room, right? It's what we measure. It's what we emit a lot. He asked about methane, right? So it's a heavier carbon molecule that's caught in the permafrost. And so it's going to start bleeding out as we melt some of the ice sheets and even places like Alaska. Why he's laughing is that methane is 22 times more dense than carbon dioxide. We worry about carbon dioxide if methane starts coming out in big volumes, and we don't have a clue how much is trapped. I mean,
The nice thing is supposed to go away in 100 years. So we only have 100 years of methane.
Right.
The bright side.
Yeah, that's good. You gotta be optimistic, man, or we're just gonna put our heads in the ice and forget. Okay, so let's go back to our sort of model. So that's what's happening around us. You know, we can quibble about how fast and how long it's going to be, but that's happening, right? I mean, the data are really, really clear. So let's talk about what that means for us in South Florida. And one of the things it means that I think people don't think too much about is what is happening with the Everglades. We all know about the Everglades, but what are we sitting on right here? Coral. We're sitting on old coral reefs, right? And old coral reefs look like this. They're full of holes. They're really porous, okay? What that means is water moves in and out of this stuff really, really easily. One of the things that drives me crazy is I hear people in South Florida say, oh, well, look at New York. Let's look at what Scandinavia is doing. We'll just build seawalls. Well, that's fine for where the seawall is. It doesn't help us with the water going underneath and up, right? We have a very different problem than Scandinavia or the city of New York. And so we can say, look, they're solving all the problems. They have solved all the problems. They haven't, for not where we live, not for the geology that we're sitting on. So we've got this really precarious problem where we've got salt water, which is rising. We've got this really porous limestone that we're sitting on. And then we've got the fresh water, which, of course, we depend for our drinking water, okay, and our agriculture and everything else. What's the biggest issue we've got? So here's the Everglades. This is how it once was. And it's biggest and greatest, and then we turned it into something like this, right? A much smaller form of itself, okay? What does that mean? In the very simplest form, what it means is we've drained about 2/3 of the Everglades, or a third of the Everglades, and sea level is rising. If I tell you to simply think about pressure, and one thing is going up, down, what do you think happens? This pushes, right? And so we've got a really serious problem here in terms of salt water moving into our groundwater and into our drinking water and into the water we need for agriculture. And it's because we have a lower volume of fresh water in the Everglades than we once had, and we're getting an increasing volume of sea level. So we should be talking about a new road system, a new way of building buildings, even ways of alternative fuels. But first and foremost, I urge you all to think really hard and to sort of help us with moving the Everglades Restoration Project along. Because if we don't fill the Everglades back up with clean water, we have no shot at pushing back the salt water. Yes?
My name is Luis Rodriguez. I do have a question. I'm an oceanographer as well, marine biologist as well, and work with the environment, and I'm 100% in support of the restoration of the Everglades. However, I do have a question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that most of the Everglades is just 1 or 2 feet above sea level. And according to the latest predictions that information that I have read and received, is that we're expecting 1 foot sea level rise within 15 feet. I'm sorry, within 15 years, and 2 feet by maybe 25 to 30 years. So I'm just, and that my main question is, we're working on investing $10 billion on restoring the Everglades, and when we expecting then within 15 years, probably a big portion of it to be underwater.
So very good point, but here's the issue. So the 2 degrees above sea level is buffered by a whole bunch of land in between it and a whole lot of other things. But even the 2-foot rise, before it comes over land, deep enough to get into the fresh water, with the Everglades where it currently is, and the sea's going up even a foot or 2 feet, the problem is first it's going to push underneath. And so one of our biggest challenges, I think, is to get people to understand that it's not what's going to come over that's going to be most effective, it's what's going to come under. And that is all exacerbated by the fact that we're pumping these aquifers like crazy. I mean, it's what is it, Tiffany, 8 billion gallons or something like that. This is one of your slides. I mean, we're pumping so much water that we're creating this pressure difference, okay? So you're right that at some point, the Everglades will be salt water because of what comes over it. But we have a lot of life in us before all of that, and a lot of agriculture and stuff. So that's how I think about it. I mean, and we're still talking, I think, about 80 or 100 years. So, okay, so if we don't do if we keep pumping fresh water the way we currently are, and we don't do anything in terms of restoring the fresh water in the Everglades, we're going to be out of drinking water in 2 decades. I mean, that's the difference in time frame that I worry about. And we already have some long-term monitoring sites associated with the Florida Coastal Everglades Long-Term Ecological Research Program at FIU, and we're seeing salt moving in. We're getting sodium chloride signatures already, okay? But point well taken, in the long run, it's all going under, right? Okay, so where does that leave us? So the first thing I hope I made clear was this is an issue, but we've got some things closer to home that we could concentrate on, right? We have a much greater dependence on the Everglades and our freshwater and our groundwater systems than I think we typically think about. We all think about the waves coming over top of us and inundating everything, and so I hope that you understand that we have a really strong connection between what we can do in Coral Gables and the rest of the coast and our reliance on the Florida Everglades, okay? So what do you do about all this? The science is really clear. Yes, there's some there's some uncertainty about when and how fast. So what do we do? So there are 2 levels of responses that we think about. Mitigation is sort of the long view. What is the issue? What's the problem? What's the cause of all of this? CO2, right? It's carbon dioxide emission or trapped methane. It's that we have a carbon-based economy, that we're burning fossil fuels and we're releasing those carbon molecules into the atmosphere and they trap heat. That's the issue, right? That's the cause. So in the long run, we have to do something about the CO2 concentrations and buildups. I was raised by a father who's an economist. I believe that markets equilibrate things. The problem is the market switching from a carbon-based economy to a non-carbon-based economy is going to take a long time unless we get really serious about it. And it'll be too late for South Florida by the time the market equilibrates with environmental causes. It's fine if you live in Iowa or places like that. I mean, that's, there's more beachfront property that'll be for sale. But if you're us, it's not so great. And so one of the things we have to do is think about mitigation no matter what. And we have to sort of be aggressive about thinking about moving away from carbon-based economies and other ways of changing the CO2 emissions and buildup in the atmosphere. And I'll come back to that. The other thing that's probably much more germane to a group like this is adaptation. Modifying our infrastructure or behavior to adjust to all the issues that we face, right? This is going to take many, many decades and probably a century or two. I mean, I hope not, and I'll tell you why I have more hope. But this is a long-term solution, right? It's going to take a while. These are the kinds of things that your smart city council and your mayor are thinking about now. What are we going to do now to make life better and more sustainable given all of the things we just talked about? Okay, so let's talk about mitigation. This is where I have huge hope. These are all pilot projects that are going on all over the world. The U.S. is getting pretty aggressive. These are carbon scrubbers. These are huge fans that basically push air into a chemical, a factory basically that chemically takes the CO2 and spits out hydrogen, oxygen, and other compounds, okay? So it's not only, so now what we're starting to think about is let's think out of the box. We're not going to stop CO2 emissions tomorrow, and even if we did, I already told you that we've already heated the ocean up by 0.8 degrees. So even if we stop all carbon dioxide emissions today, we're still going to have 5 to 7 feet of sea level rise. I mean, if you stopped it all right now, right, we've already got to the point of an almost 1 degree increase in the seas, and it's going to go higher than that, okay? So we can't just think about that. We have to start thinking about other proactive things. We have people, and the Australians are really pushing the envelope here in terms of trying to figure out ways of taking CO2 and pumping it down into really deep ocean aquifers where it can sit for millennia like it has in the past, okay? So, there are a lot of these kinds of things, and they're everything in between. I mean, there are people, there's a great program at Michigan State University looking at how to, plants take up CO2, right? So the more plants we have, the more photosynthesis we have, the more CO2 that comes in. If we turn that CO2 in the plant biomass into something that we can burn that doesn't put CO2 back in the atmosphere, that's a win-win, okay? And so there are people really thinking about how to take the CO2, capture it with plants, turn the plants into fuels, and then capture, not let very much CO2 get emitted, okay? So there are really interesting mitigation processes out there, and I really believe that human ingenuity will eventually get to the point where we start taking carbon dioxide out. Now, does that mean don't worry about it and keep burning fossil fuels? Only if you want to sell your property soon. Okay? Okay, so Matt gave me this, and I was really impressed. So this is some proposals out of the Mass Sustainability Plan for Coral Gables. And what I was struck by was you're talking about things that help you in the short term, certainly economically, but things that also are mitigation strategies. I mean, all these things basically do the right thing in the long view, okay? And so I was super impressed that these are things that are on the table to be thinking about. They have short-term benefits for sure, but they also have really long-term benefits, and that's a really cool thing. Okay, and so, I urge you to think about those. And this was a graph out of Matt's presentation in which he's talking about, the reduction in CO2. And I'll tell you in a minute about a project that we're hopefully doing with the Department of Transportation where we can sort of model and measure decreases in CO2 output on a per car basis, right? If we just change our driving behaviors and stuff, we can greatly modify local CO2 using different kinds of transportation modes. Okay, so adaptations. So what are the things that we can do right now? How many of you know about this Eyes on the Rise? They've had PBS specials. They've got a great website. If you haven't gone there, please do. Juliet Pinto, Kate McMillan, and Susan Jacobson. What you do is you put your zip code in, okay? You go to this little app, and so there's our house here in Coral Gables. Here's the golf course. And our house is at 10.5 feet. You know, I feel great relative to my friends in South Beach and Miami. And then you basically push this little meter and say, so what do I look like at 1, 2, 3, 5? So here we are, Coral Gables right now. And here we are, Coral Gables at 6 feet of sea level. Now we're already going to be there. We don't know how fast, but we already know that we've reached a temperature that we're going to get a 6-foot rise in the seas sometime. Hopefully, well, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Hopefully in my lifetime. I want to see this. I mean, the great news is we become an island, right? So we're like Sanibel all of a sudden. Right? Property values go up and everything. But look at the golf courses, right? I mean, basically water comes in from the bottom and all the golf courses just go away. They become lakes, right? So we go from golfing to bass fishing or something. But that's what it looks like in Coral Gables, and we're basically surrounded by water. Okay, so this is an app that you should look at. It's not perfect. It's got some errors associated with it, but it's getting better and better. And you know, the maps look pretty good when you sort of go around. And so you can point to your very own house and sort of go through this exercise. But I think it's fascinating to sort of look at, for every foot of sea level rise, what happens. And Coral Gables really is quite lucky, except for South Gables. Right? The very south part has some issues right off the bat, as you would expect. This is another slide from Tiffany. This is a really interesting analysis that's been done. People always talk about the tidal flooding and what's coming over top of the land. I hope that we've given you enough information to say let's worry first about what goes under our feet and into our drinking water. But what comes over the land is certainly an issue. And what is very interesting about this is Miami is like the most vulnerable of all of the cities where they did these analyses. Key West is like number 4. But basically what happens is we're going to have these tidal floods. Right now it's less than 10 of these a year. Most of them are associated with king tides or really violent storm surges, right? But based on the modeling that's been done here, by 2045 we'll have like 240 of these. So more than every other day, we're going to get these massive waves and massive overtop flooding like Miami Beach sees from tides. Again, this is mostly has an impact on the South Gables. Well, we've got some, there's a lot of things we can start doing. I was talking about the green infrastructure. If you're really worried about this sort of overtopping from the coast, then there are lots of things you can do, like put natural sand dunes in between, or dunes in between the ocean and you. It's interesting that we have a little beach house in St. Augustine, and it's behind a 20-foot sand dune. We don't pay flood insurance, right? We live a block from the ocean, and we don't pay any flood insurance because we have a 20-foot natural intact sand dune in front of us. You can bet that the people who've lived on St. Augustine Island all these years are really, really happy that they didn't tear that thing apart to expand the beach, right? I mean, think of the money that saves in terms of not having to pay for flood insurance. But we can put some of those things back. And things like seagrass beds and coral reefs, those all sort of help. They don't help those huge violent surges, but they help on a day-to-day basis because they slow down the energy of waves. Water has a huge amount of energy behind it. There are a lot of cities around the world now that are sort of they're using their canal systems and even old road beds and basically making them a sort of a sump for water, right? To sort of store water in a relatively clean way, have vegetation in it. And then of course we're going to have to build up, right? I mean, I'm continuously amazed to watch the development that happens at Miami Beach in downtown Miami. And again, the problem with the disconnect between economics and what's happening with the global environment. Economists and the economics of building and real estate works on like a 9 to 12 month cycle, right? Most of the investors get their money back on bonds that turn over in 9 to 12 months. And we're fighting problems that are 30 years down the road. So there's this huge disconnect on how we're making decisions. And so, I think the right kind of aggressive zoning laws and stuff like that are something that should at least be on the table. It's not my area, but I think it seems quite obvious to me that we got to start building up, okay? And then there are lots and lots of things to do for making water, making space for water. I mean, let's just face it, it's going to come, and the question is, what do you do with it? Do you allow it to infiltrate all of your infrastructure? And basically, you know, salt water is one of the most corrosive things you can possibly have, or do you in fact channel it so that you basically protect your the things that you have, the infrastructure you have, and just learn to live with the fact that the water is going to slosh in and it's going to slosh out, but you're going to build a town or a city in a way that's going to allow that to happen. We all know that Miami Beach has been very, very aggressive. They put in, I forget how much money they've spent, but they put in those really big pumps. And for right now, those pumps look like they are working from the perspective of the amount of water that they're pumping out. But there are some other issues that come with that amount of pumping and water, and where do you put that water and stuff like that, right? So anyhow, there's a lot of things. I'm sorry. There are a lot of handbooks out there. We were just in D.C. This weekend, actually, and went to a talk on smart cities. And there are some really interesting sort of handbooks out there about tried and true things in various kinds of geologies and climates that people can do. And I know Matt and his team have sort of looked at all of these things, and you're going to visit all these things about how we're going to affect transportation and stuff like that, okay? So I just wanted to throw up a few examples of some things that we're doing right now that sort of are germane to this. So we have our Florida Coastal Everglades program I told you about, a long-term ecological research program, and one of the centers that I'm the director of, the Southeast Environmental Research Center, CERC. And we've been working very hard to understand ecology and especially the hydrology of the Everglades. So we do have wells out there. We are watching for saltwater intrusion. We are trying to make the tight connections between the seas going up and our fresh water and our drinking water and even our agricultural water. We have a lot of research going on water quality, both at the coast, in the canals, in the rivers, in the wetlands. We do a very good job of monitoring what kinds of things are happening, where the contaminants are coming from, and then thinking about ways to remediate those. We have a really cool group that's part of the Sea Level Solution Center. It's a very eclectic group, the Sustainable Built Environment and Informatics Program. So these are architects, they're engineers, and they're computer scientists. And they came together and ecologists. They came together as a group to say, how do we build a smarter city? How do we build a smarter building? How do we actually think about this? Think about a building that sits on the coast or sits in a place where seawater comes off and on. You have to have a building that's smart enough to say, uh-oh, it's salt water, pump it out. Oh, it's fresh water, pump it in, right? I mean, it's not as trivial as it sounds. And so this is a really interesting group of people who are really trying to figure out solutions for these things. And then our newest endeavor with the Sea Level Solutions Center, and then the Center for Advanced Knowledge Enablement, and then the U.S. Department of Transportation, they put out a call for envisioning smart cities. And it really is around the transportation sector. I mean, what are you going to do when all the roads are flooded? It's an issue with traffic wrecks and human health and stuff like that. But more than that, it's a huge source of carbon dioxide. If I asked you what proportion of the transportation sector do you think is responsible for our CO2 emissions, what would you say? 30? It's 30, it's right on, great. So it's 30% of all of the CO2 emissions come from transportation. And it's amazing how quickly you can add up, changing to hybrid cars, to electric cars, to lower CO2 emitting cars, right? One of the interesting things about automobiles is, in this day and age, they're not perfectly efficient, but they're pretty efficient when you go 60 miles an hour. They're really inefficient when you sit at a traffic light. So if you have a carbon dioxide sensor in your town, every time a light turns red, and it stays red for a long time, the CO2 goes up measurably in that area. I mean, you can watch the CO2 go up. So imagine a city in which the lights weren't timed so much for traffic, but were timed based on minimizing CO2 outputs. If you think about it, that's perfectly correlated with minimizing traffic, because you don't sit. You sit for as little as you can. But rather than being triggered by bus lines and other kinds of decision points, it's triggered by the lowest CO2 emission you can possibly build in your city. So we've just put in a proposal to sort of think of a city that could be run like that. This is my grandson. This is the dune, actually, at our house in St. Augustine. And so I have a lot of hope, and I feel a lot of responsibility for thinking about these problems, for solving these problems, and for building a better future. Thanks.
We have time now for questions and answers, so feel free.
The ocean's been rising and falling for thousands of years. Because I have a farm in North Florida that I farmed for some 40 years. I plowed up a bunch of bones one day and called an anthropologist from the university. He identified these things as a porpoise. Now, the elevation at my farm is around 100 feet. So at one time there was an ocean that covered my farm almost on the Georgia line. I have in my possession, I also went to this anthropologist. I had a bunch of teeth I found, large teeth, shark's teeth. And he identified those as a huge shark that lived thousands and thousands of years ago. So oceans have been rising and falling for different reasons for millenniums. And I just have to confirm what you're saying here, that I haven't had these things, and I've also, strangely enough, found teeth of different types on the farm. I farmed for some 40 years. Some were identified as camel's teeth. And when camels lived in North Florida, I have no idea. And also some small teeth I found were from a three-toed horse, which came from, I don't know how many millenniums ago. So we've had sea level rising and falling, not due to industrial CO2. Where the CO2 came from millenniums ago caused sea levels to rise and fall. I have no idea what the volcano.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that this is what the pattern looks like, right? So there has been an ebb and flow of CO2, temperature, and sea level. I mean, at one point, Florida was way, way underwater, right? I mean, you can see back. Yeah. Right. The issue for us is that there has been a natural ebb and flow of CO2, which has caused a natural ebb and flow of temperature and sea level. The issue now for us is, if you draw a line across here, this is the issue, right? That's really, so we're on uncharted water. And, we weren't around back here to actually care, right? So, but you're absolutely right. It's been coming up and down forever. I mean, one of the ways we understand all of this is there are coastal wetlands. There's in western Florida and North Carolina, which are basically, the geology is such that when the seas rise, the sediments pack down exactly proportional to the seas going up. And so you can measure exactly what sea levels were, basically looking at how those sediments were deposited and stuff. So, I mean, there is a natural cycle there. It's just that we're here now, and we're now at a place that's not natural anymore.
Dr. Crowell, question.
Yes.
I think, as I say, the average citizen really doesn't seem to have been very engaged. You get some questions like, well, tell me what I can do about it and I'll do something, or I'll leave it to my grandkids, or I'm worried about things today. But I think what you're going to see is probably in a few years, a number of things are going to wake people up. One, we counted the number of boats behind our bridges. We have 302 boats. If you have a boat now, you have to wait for low tide to get under those bridges. There'll be just a few more inches and an awful lot of the boats, and then the property values. We have 47 miles of waterfront exposure in Coral Gables, more than Miami Beach. So that's going to be the first thing when people can't get the boats out. Secondly, it's going to be when the mortgage companies don't offer a 30-year mortgage. A 30-year mortgage now is 2046. A lot of those charts have a 2050 and a 2100. So I think you're going to find mortgage companies saying, I got to think about that, especially in the South Gables where it's 1.1 feet below sea level in Deering Bay, up to 4 feet in some parts of Coco Plum and along there. Then you're going to find the insurance, which is already very expensive. And then in terms of cities, the rating agencies are going to say, what are you doing to prepare? Do you have your head in the sand? If not, we're going to lower your bond ratings.
Yep.
So there'll be some things coming to,
Yep.
way
Yeah.
before you see the sea level rising.
Yeah, my sense is, you're absolutely right, and the insurance rates are already being adjusted faster than I can even imagine, and pricing some people right out of the markets down here. I just hope they happen fast enough that the reactions, the reaction time is not one of absolute panic and running away, but rather one of a positive, let's try to get this straightened out, right? And again, the biggest thing is, let's never forget about our fresh water, our source of fresh water. I mean, that's just something that, the problem with that one is, it's kind of far removed. It doesn't affect the guy with the boat. It doesn't affect a lot of the things, and yet that will be something that will really put us out of business if we run out of fresh water for drinking and agriculture. So that's a sort of a, we beat that sort of bush constantly because it's kind of easy to forget about that one because you see this other stuff.
If you go down to Flamingo in the Everglades, there are signs that the rangers have put, which indicates that the water down there in the water fountain is not safe to drink because it's got too much salt in it. So this is not a myth, it's here, it's now.
I feel like, what can we do now? And I know that the garbage creates methane gas. And we could start organizing to zero garbage like San Francisco and New York and other big cities are doing. So that's something that we can start tomorrow. I'm trying to do it myself at home, and I finish with no garbage. And the garbage that I finish, it can be composting, that it will improve our soil, and it creates jobs. And why is that deal that Coral Gables is not for mandate recycle, but just whoever wants to do it? And why we accept that the restaurants waste so much food? The food pollutes 100 times worse in the fields than the cars. So with something that we all can feel good about doing, create jobs, have a better soil, and we can start doing it tomorrow. Let's start organizing, and the city should study it and give us lessons on how to do it until we go to zero garbage. No garbage. Everything can be recycled. We shouldn't have plastic bags, and we shouldn't have a styrofoam. They should be prohibited, and we have to start doing something right now, because I told Kathy once after I had my first granddaughter in April, and when she was 2 days old, it was the Earth Day. So I came and talked to Kathy, and I said, listen, Kathy, her mother got married in Vizcaya, and I want my granddaughter to have the choice to get married in Vizcaya, and if we don't do something, Vizcaya will be underwater. We can do something right now. The city can be the example for all South Florida. Let's start with the garbage.
By the way, we just at our last commission meeting banned styrofoam and looking out.
Styrofoam, right. Styrofoam is outlawed in the city of Coral Gables. In all of our restaurants, all of our business, in our clubs and everything else, people are being educated that you can no longer use styrofoam. If we have events here in the city and vendors come in, they're not allowed to use styrofoam either. So we have taken that initiative. The issue with plastic bags is that it is held up in Tallahassee. They will preempt any action we take with regard to plastic bags.
Yes, if I could add, and
Greg?
Yes.
I'm the city attorney. There's a statute by the legislature which says that they're going to study the issue of plastic bags from a few years ago, and it says that no action can be taken until the results of the study comes back, but no results have ever come back. So it operates effectively like a abatement or a stay, it's called, but it prevents any action from a local government, which is unfortunate that the city can't act. Hopefully that will change at some point.
One of the problems, I asked FEMA, what percent of Coral Gables residents have flood insurance, and it's only 26%. This year, they're going to redo the flood maps for this area. So I think more areas, as they take in the scientific evidence, and FEMA decides which of those lines they're going to look at, flood insurance rates are going to probably go up.
You know, there's an interesting disconnect. So a lot of coastal cities, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, use the FEMA data really strictly and really look at it closely to try to understand risk and vulnerability. But there's this interesting phenomena in South Florida that lots of people don't claim flood. You know, their data don't show up in FEMA. They just pay to get it fixed, or somehow we don't end up in the FEMA database, and it sort of underestimates the vulnerability we have in some of those ways. I tried to analyze some of the data, and it just didn't make any sense to me, and I found out that it's a different kind of economy. And I would guess that the reason some of those people don't have insurance is that they paid cash for that house a long time ago, right?
They don't have mortgages, they're not forced to. They're not forced to.
That they don't have to.
A question about the restoration of the Everglades and how important that is, and there's already whether laws or whatever in the books, and it seems to be a function of monies between the federal government, state government, and who's going to pay what and who's not. And I know that mayors in this area, for instance, Mayor Kaysen, Mayor Stoddard, and Mayor Lerner in particular, and Mayor Lerner I think may have been the first that got on the mayor, so then we're talking about local support throughout the country, and particularly those of us who are on the coast. What is it that we can do as citizens to get, I'll disdain from the editorial comment about the governor, who seems to be stuck in the mud about not funding the restoration in the Everglades that's so important to us.
So let me make an observation, and please, you have to realize that we moved here a year and a half, right? So in all of my 1.5 years of being a Coral Gables resident and a resident of South Florida, here's what I think I know. The view of Florida from Tallahassee stops at Orlando, right? As far as I can tell, there is nothing south of Orlando as far as Tallahassee can tell. You already did the right thing. When I first moved here, you passed a proposition to put all this money into purchasing lands for conservation and wetlands restoration. So at one level, you all did the right thing. Now the issue is, how do we connect the dots and make sure that Tallahassee takes the money that you all pay, and I was amazed when I moved here and saw the vote. You know, there's a clear passion and desire to do this. So now the question is, what do we have to do to put pressure on the powers that be to actually make sure that they go forward with the plans? And we already had one great missed opportunity because we had a chance to buy the sugar lands for a greatly reduced value. And that time came and went, and we didn't pull the trigger on that. So, I'm too much of an optimist to say that set us back indefinitely. But, we just need to keep pushing and saying this is what we voted for, and this is what we need. And it's much more important for South Florida to have that restoration and the Everglades put back and to fix Okeechobee. And we have good technologies, right? We can build reservoirs, clean up the water, and we can all get something of what we need. I mean, we can do this. And I don't know. I mean, these guys are your elected officials, and they know how government works much better than I do. But it seems to me that most of the citizens did the right thing. They stepped up. They voted with their pocketbooks.
Let me tell you one thing that 17 mayors in this area have written to candidates Bush and Rubio, who have not said positive things about their belief in science, and we've asked them to meet, and they've agreed. So we're hoping to meet before the next debate here and privately with them and try to convince them that they ought to set up support, regardless of whether they win or not, but in their positions, to set up a federal resiliency fund so that people can start planning for, if you have a retreat strategy someday, that there's money available, and it's not just walking backwards with nothing in your pocket. So
we saw that letter.
So doing that, and we have $250,000 in our budget in Coral Gables for sea level rise, and we're looking how best to use that. But as I say, we've started with trying to get the most accurate data, measuring the risks so people can make their own determinations which line they want to believe in, and decide what they're going to do about their own situation.
We also have a sustainability group here within the city that is doing a sustainability study that will come out and give us some real actionable things that we can do on sustainability. So I think that as a city, we are working very hard to on this. And again, this is a matter of awareness and education. And we're here tonight, and we will be here 2 more times to promote awareness and to educate our community. So I really encourage you to please ask the people that you know that aren't here to come and to learn about it and to get involved and to write their legislators, to talk to their legislators, and to vote with your conscience.
And we'll have this on a CD available, and it'll be on Coral Gables television as well, so if you
Yeah.
tell people,
Can I add,
yeah,
Mr. Mayor, can I mention the white paper that you asked?
yeah.
Yes, also, I just wanted everyone to know that the mayor has requested, and I know the commission supports, my office preparing basically a legal memorandum or white paper that looks at how different cities are addressing climate change from a legal perspective, such as through land use and zoning, conditions of approval, other sort of requirements going forward over the next few decades. You know, some of these developments that are coming into Coral Gables, you know, hopefully will be here for decades, and that will at some point implicate climate change. So the times that we can put requirements on them, though, are typically when they come to the commission for approval. So the mayor has asked us to, you know, use foresight and come up with all the different legal issues that may come up decade by decade as this progresses, so that we can have a leading paper that can be distributed to other cities as well, but that will be related to Coral Gables, including with, he mentioned retreat strategies, and that's, you know, in several decades, but it's still planning so that people know when they come here, what is the city of Coral Gables' legal approach, which ultimately protects property rights and lets people know what they can and can't do in the future related to their property. What is our strategy or goal? And so, and what we will be doing is we have a special counsel that we've asked to help put this together. Her name is Abby Corbett. She's not here today, but she will be coming to future ones. And she is here? Oh, good. So
Abby
our
is here
special
with us.
counsel is here, so we may have her speak a little bit at a future meeting, but she's putting this information together, and it's meant to be a service to Coral Gables, and I'd just like to thank the mayor for asking us to do it.
Great, you've been very patient.
I'm sorry. We're just past 7 and we were scheduled to end at 7, so go ahead,
Okay,
ask your
well,
question and.
I want to thank you for having this meeting. I think it's excellent that you're doing this. You know, one city can't solve this problem, but it can be one part of, you know, like 17 mayors getting together. But a couple things the city, I think, could do, and I'm really glad you're doing this, is I drive an electric car. There's no place to charge it in this city hardly.
We're planning for that
If we
in our
started having
garages.
solar-powered car chargers around, that would be great. But also, we're in the Sunshine State. Our brain-dead legislature has chosen not to do anything with solar panels. It's a really low-hanging piece of fruit. But anything you could do to incentivize it in the city, they don't look bad and all that would.
For those who are watching, and here as well, we've been some of the original signatories of what's called the PACE program, both residential and commercial, where there are ways that you can put a lien on your house and get all kinds of upgrades, very low interest rates. The lien stays with the house, so you don't need to have money, but you can put solar panels in, and we've got several thousand, I think, now
Yes,
that
we
have
do.
bought into it. So it's called the PACE program, and you can check online, and it'll tell you how to, if you want to do solar, or if you want to upgrade your windows or your roof, it's all in there, and it's a program's already in place.
Right, and we're planning to build 2 of our garages in the cities, the ones that are along Andalusia by the Publix and behind the Miracle Theater, and included in there will be charging stations.
Professor,
So we are introducing those things.
I want to bring this up because in all these sea level discussions, no one ever seems to bring up the fact that all the natives here knew there was a ridge. The natives that were smart built on the ridge, and there doesn't seem to be any incentive, there doesn't seem to be any zoning, anything, considering the fact that there is a ridge. I mean, I live on the ridge. I'm 22 foot above sea level. I'm sorry for those, but when it gets to 15, I guess I'll have to start worrying about it. The reason I live there is the person who built that house was a native, homesteader, potato farmer. he knew better than to go out to Tahiti Beach. But the structure, the city, the zoning, the regulations have never said build on the ridge. There are no incentives to build on the ridge. There is no incentives to, in effect, relocate to the ridge, which is perhaps one of the solutions, although it may not solve the water problem. But I never hear people talk about the fact that there's a natural ridge, it's always been here, and nobody deals with it.
Well, so Ryan Stoa is going to come and talk to you in a couple of weeks, and Ryan is a brilliant law guy who thinks about water and policy, and he's going to tell you the ramifications of some of that. And you know, one of the sad social injustices that we're going to face, and we'll face these globally, is that after things get bad and the low elevations are inundated, everybody's going to go to the ridges, and they'll displace the lower income folks and stuff like that. And that's actually one of the biggest things that drove the Pope's encyclical, talking about we got to do something that's morally right, because he was worried about the social injustice of what's going to happen to all of those communities, native communities that live on these coastal areas, and they're going to get displaced somewhere, and where does that go? I just want to thank you all very much. I want to end on one other thing. In my title I said opportunities, and this gentleman sort of talked about, you know, what he's doing, and you had a huge passion and said, you know, I'm going to do this all by myself. And so my hope and opportunity is that this is all about education, right? Not one of us will solve this problem on ourselves. The mayor won't solve this problem by himself. But all of us collectively sort of pass down our knowledge and our desire to the next generations. And my grandson, they'll get it right. They'll get the carbon scrubbers going, and they'll sort of reverse the CO2, not that we're putting it in, but that we're taking it out, and we're doing it in a really creative way, and I truly believe that. But they have to know that they should care about it, and they should have to know that that's a laudable thing to want to be able to do, and to work on better batteries and stuff like that. The other great opportunity is, and this has always been the case in the U.S., is you make progress by leading by example. And Coral Gables could, in fact, be one of those cities that leads by example. It's a cohesive place. We're very fortunate in terms of we're a pretty smart place and a pretty affluent place, and we have good leadership. But there are a lot of programs out there for cities who are willing to take the lead and then have federal grants and all kinds of stuff, international recognition to basically be a model for other kinds of cities. And we've been going to a lot of meetings and finding out all the opportunities for small places like Coral Gable to step up and say, we want to be in the spotlight.
Let me say one more thing on picking up on that. Dr. Julio Frank, the new president of University of Miami, had 3 goals when he had his inaugural speech. And the third one, he said, was relevance, and he said, University of Miami is going to be a leader in sea level rise under my leadership. So hopefully we'll have FIU, all the other universities here, put in their brain power together to see if you could come up with a way to take CO2 out of the atmosphere.
So I'd like to thank you, and now Mayor, about that open bar. Thank you very much.
We would like to thank you very much for coming. The next part of our series is on March 8th at 6 p.m. It will be in the museum. The third is on April 13th at 6 p.m. And each one of these will go through more information on one on public policy, then on design and whatever. As the doctor said here tonight, this is all about awareness and it's all about education. We, as elected leaders in this city, have made a decision that this is important to us, and we will be a lead city in this effort, and we need you to join with us and come along, and we'll make it happen. I'd like to thank Dr. Crowley and Dr. Troxler for being here tonight with us from FIU, and thank you all for coming. Good night.
As you leave, we have a couple of things. One, thank you for everyone that signed in on the sign-in sheet. And as reward, we're going to send you an email of what we're doing so far and to carry on the conversation as what we can do moving forward. So just a show of hands, how many people learned about this through the Miami Herald? And how many people learned about this through e-news? And how many people learned about it because somebody else called them and said, you should come? Great. It's helpful to us to know how to best communicate with you. We will send emails out to those that have given us their emails so that you can see what we've done so far. So people will be pleased to know where we're going, including charging stations, and also where we're going to go moving forward. So thank you very much.